So we are at Score the Shore training, our first training for the afternoon, which I'm going to be leading for you today. And this is our agenda for the rest of the day. After Score the Shore, which will take about an hour, we'll move into chlorophyll monitoring with Dr. Paul Steen, our streams program manager and a big supporter of the lakes program too. We'll have a break from 3 to 3:15, and then Eric and Elgin and I will come back at 3:15 to take you through the Exotic Aquatic Plant Watch, our invasive species monitoring program. My name is Jo Latimore. I'm a faculty member at Michigan State University in the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife, where I'm also the director of the MSU Extension Center for Lakes and Streams. And this program, MiCorps overall, both our lake monitoring program and our stream monitoring program are one of my favorite programs to be involved with, and I've been involved in various capacities over the past 20 years. I get the pleasure of working with volunteers on lakes and streams all over the state to gather some of the most high quality, most useful data we have about Michigan's surface waters. So this is something that I really enjoy doing every year. And again, I'm really happy to be here with you all today. What we're going to be talking about for the next hour is shoreline monitoring, how to collect data on the health of the shorelines of your lakes. Healthy shorelines are really valuable. They're important because they provide habitat for fish and birds, amphibians, and other animals that live in the lake. And they also maintain water quality, they help limit erosion, and they slow rain runoff from carrying potentially pollutants and excess runoff and water into your lake. So healthy shorelines are something we want to maintain. And as we understand it, shoreline degradation is one of the biggest pressures on our lakes here in Michigan. Our shorelines are threatened because development around shorelines often eliminates the important components of a healthy shoreline. Things like lawns and putting in rock and seawalls really remove optimal habitat locations. And then our activities along the shoreline, like lots of foot traffic or installing docks, and even our desire for an unobstructed view, remove the vegetation that stops erosion and helps keep our habitat along the shoreline intact. I want to show a few examples of how shorelines on Michigan lakes have changed just in the last several decades. This is an aerial photo of Gun Lake in southwest Michigan, taken in 1938. And you can see there's some agriculture along this side of the lake, but mostly around the lake. You may see a few little driveway areas along here, but it's mostly undeveloped. Let's compare that to what an aerial view of the very same spot looked like in the year 2014. You should be able to see heavy residential development all around this end of the lake that was not there in the 30s, and even canals that have been dug to add additional access to the lake for property owners. And this is not unusual on lakes in Michigan, where development has gone quickly over the last several decades. Here's another part of the same lake, again, 1938 to 2014. Again, you can see there's a lot more people accessing the lake. There's a lot more properties along the lake that are heavily developed. Drainage patterns have changed significantly. And another thing you might don't notice is that the edges of the lake have become much more defined as property owners have stabilized shorelines, perhaps put in seawalls or other structures to prevent erosion. You can imagine that it looks different and it even sounds different along these shorelines. You're not going to hear the birds, you're not going to hear the frogs or see the fish swimming around as much as you did back when the shorelines were natural. I'll show you one more example. Again, 1938 to 2014. This picture specifically, you can see all of this is seawalled all along here. This has all been reinforced to prevent erosion and loss of shoreline property. And that's an understandable desire. If you're going to build a home near a lake, you don't want your new property washing away. But unfortunately, we sometimes go overboard in what we do to try and stop erosion by putting in seawalls where they may not be needed, We also tend to remove natural vegetation, trees, vegetation in the water itself. That's really important habitat. Trees are also even super important. When they die and fall in, they make habitat, and we'll see examples of that a little bit later. We tend to replace that with lawns, maybe a few ornamental plants, things that don't really belong at a lakeshore. And so it's become very unnatural and typically does not support nearly the life that it would if it had been left in a fairly natural state. And there's certainly ways to balance human use and natural habitat needs, but sometimes we go too far, thinking about our own desires and not giving enough consideration or protection to the habitat along the shoreline. Now, how this fits into the Cooperative Lakes Monitoring Program is through this program, Score the Shore. The Score the Shore was developed as directly as a result of talking with the volunteers in our program. A few years ago, this is the newest part of the Cooperative Lakes Monitoring Program. A few years ago, we talked to our volunteers and asked them what else would they like to learn about. We're measuring water quality, we're tracking plant life, we're looking at invasive species, and we're building this really strong database about our lakes. But there's always the opportunity to add additional parameters. And when we talked to our volunteers about what they wanted to know more about, what they wanted to be able to collect data on that they could use to track the health of their lakes, data on shoreline quality was the #1 request. In fact, it outshined any other options that we presented to our volunteers. And so in response to that, we developed Score the Shore. And Score the Shore is based on looking at other protocols for assessing shoreline health that are used by state and federal agencies and local nonprofits and so forth. And the outcome was a protocol that allows our volunteers to learn how to assess the shoreline on their lake in a way that's not only useful to you locally, but also useful to state agencies, federal agencies, researchers, others who are interested in patterns not only on a single lake, but kind of what's going on lakes all over the region. And so we're really proud of this program. We wanted to balance scientific accuracy and precision with something that wasn't too much work for our volunteers to do, and we think we've hit that sweet spot. So what we provide for you is a standardized approach that helps you assess the health of your shoreline, helps you identify high quality shoreline on your lake that you can protect, and also to discover opportunities on your lake for shoreline improvement and restoration. And we worked with volunteers, like in this photo, to test the protocol and make sure it was something that was understandable and fun and interesting for our volunteers to do. So we really appreciate the volunteers that helped us make this a reality. If you're wondering what good this information is, I've hinted at it already, but it's really useful locally for your lake association or just in your community if you don't have an association. It really can be useful in supporting educational efforts to show people around the lake and in your community what parts of your lake are doing well from a shoreline habitat perspective and what areas could use some improvement. It can inform your lake management planning and projects that you might want to do, whether that's on people's private property, they're thinking about what they could be doing to improve their shoreline habitat, or if it's a larger scale project that your whole community is pitching in for, or maybe there's a public park or some publicly owned land that could be managed better to protect shorelines. And of course, the data is also really useful, as I mentioned before, for regional, statewide, and even national assessments of the health of our lake shores, into research into that topic, and providing reports on the state of our systems and what opportunities are there for improvement. Now, you might be wondering, once we've scored our shore, which I'll show you how to do in the rest of this hour, what resources are out there to help us maybe improve or protect the shoreline that we have. And a couple of resources that I'll refer you to right away are the Michigan Natural Shoreline Partnership and their program, Michigan Shoreland Stewards. The Michigan Natural Shoreline Partnership is a partnership of many agencies and organizations across Michigan who are dedicated to the protection of our lake shorelines. And our own Eric Elgin, who you'll hear from later today, is one of the leaders of that partnership. And they work really hard to develop resources and trainings for people and landscape professionals who work on shorelines and are interested in protecting them. So if you're interested in this topic, I urge you to check out the Shoreline Partnership's website. You'll find a lot of really great reading and resources, even a list of certified natural shoreline professionals that have been trained and certified through this program to do lake-friendly shoreline work. Also accessible through that site is the Michigan Shoreland Stewards Program. While what I'm about to explain to you is a protocol for assessing the shoreline of your entire lake, the Michigan Shoreland Stewards is made for individuals, for people who own lakefront property to or manage it, to take a quiz online at the michiganshorelinestewards.org, where you answer questions about your shoreline and you'll get a score, as well as advice on how you might be able to improve some of the things you're doing or keep doing what you're doing if you score really high. And you may also even be eligible for a Michigan Shoreland Steward sign that you can post on your property to show your neighbors what a great job you're doing and that you're doing all things right. So we urge you to check those out. There are also some resources called Shoreline Living. These are magazine-style outreach materials produced by the Michigan or the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership. And they are full of beautiful pictures and stories from real homeowners across the Midwest, including a lot in Michigan, telling the story of how they have protected or restored their shorelines and all the benefits that they're seeing from doing that. So if you're looking to read more stories or tell more stories about shoreline protection, Shoreline Living, both volumes have some really great stories and pictures for you to use. All right, the actual procedure, score the shore. What are we asking you to do? Basically, the idea is to divide your lakeshore into roughly 1,000-foot sections. And for each 1,000-foot section, fill out a scoring form, a data sheet for each section. You'll do that from a boat where you just cruise along these sections of shoreline and have your clipboard and your data sheet on there and answer some questions. And as you'll see, when you answer those questions, you'll start earning points towards the final score for that section of shoreline. And those points on a 0 to 100 scale will give you a sense of how well that section of shoreline is scoring. And at the end, you can even calculate the average score for your whole lake. And it's important, we think, for lakes to share their results with other people on the lake and in the community. This is a really valuable educational tool. And many of our lakes and the volunteers there that have conducted Score the Shore have found it really valuable to be able to show these maps, to show these scores to their neighbors at a lake association meeting, in a newsletter, just casually. Share them with your township, your planning commission, your lake improvement board, whatever you have in your community, to show where on the lake things are looking good and where on the lake you have opportunities for improvement. We even hear stories of lake associations sharing this information and getting a little competitive where, you know, if a person lives in an area that isn't scoring as well as the other area, they a little good-natured ribbing and hoping that, hey, maybe in 5 years we can redo this survey and we'll be doing better than you. And that's great. If it's all for the betterment of the shoreline, we encourage it. And it's also important to remind people, though, that the results of this are not regulatory in any way. This is a data collection and education process. No one's going to get in trouble for anything that you write down on a data sheet. No one's going to be reported for doing anything wrong. That's not what this is for. This is to raise awareness and assess the current status of the shoreline on your lake. All right, let's dig into the procedure and how this really works. So you have to have some paperwork on hand. We create and provide all of this. That'll either get mailed to you or you can print it off of our website. We have the procedures there in written form that you can print out and read there, and also our data forms. And there's 2 different data forms. One's just a survey cover sheet, which I'll show you in a minute, that just kind of includes all the information about what lake you're on, who helped with this, kind of your overall assessment. And then there's a section data form for every 1,000-foot section. You'll make copies of that one. And so if you have a big lake, you might end up with a pretty big stack of papers. If you have a fairly small lake, you may just have a few. So that's the paperwork that's needed. And then, of course, you just need equipment to get out on the boat and fill out those sheets. So have a boat. All your safety equipment, remember, safety is super important, and we don't want to hear any stories of anyone having a problem or an accident, what they're out there doing, they're monitoring. Bring copies of the data forms and the procedure, something to write with that's waterproof. So waterproof markers, pencils, you never know if you might get splashed on the boat. So it's super important to not use a ballpoint pen, for example, that could wash all your hard work away. Clipboards are really helpful. You could bring a GPS unit or a phone that can collect GPS coordinates. You don't have to have that. It's optional. You can also record your location simply by noting landmarks, for example. But GPS units do make it a little bit easier. Having a camera is really helpful. Again, not necessary, but really helpful for documenting some of the things that you see. Of course, be considerate of your neighbors and, be thoughtful about if you're taking pictures of someone's property. Be very considerate in that case. Binoculars can be helpful to help you see what you're seeing up on the shore when you're out on your boat. And tally counters, those little clickers that you use to count off things, can be really helpful because you're asked to count things like buildings and docks and such that you see on the shore. So being able to click is really helpful. Other important things to consider. When should we do this and how long is it going to take? So we recommend don't do this until at least mid-June, maybe a little later if you're up north. You want the vegetation to be fully leafed out because you're going to be spending a lot of time looking at the state of the vegetation along the shoreline. The length of time, of course, depends on the size of your lake. Lakes that are small can get this done in 2 hours sometimes, but it's going to be longer if you're on a bigger lake. And you may need to divide it up over several days. That's okay. You may want to have several teams going out on a big lake and, doing different quadrants of the lake, whatever you think works best for you. What we have found when we've been out on the lake with volunteers is that a 1,000-foot section can take from a half an hour to 45 minutes at first when you're getting familiar with the procedure and learning how to do it. But once you're comfortable with it and familiar with it, you can usually do a 1,000-foot section in 15 minutes, no more than 30 minutes per section. So keep that in mind as you're planning. And then we recommend repeating the survey every 3 to 5 years. There's no rule about how often you have to repeat the survey, but there's a lot of value in repeating it every so often because then you can compare how things are changing on your lake over time. All right, as you're getting started, we recommend that you do some work on land before you head out on the boat. What we suggest you do is set up shoreline sections ahead of time. Figure out along your lake where those 1,000-foot sections are going to be. They don't have to be perfect. Like right here, you can see we didn't take and go way up in this to measure the 1,000 feet. It's okay if they're a little rough. Totally fine. And we find that Google Maps is really, really a useful tool for doing this. If you're good with a ruler scale and your pencil on a paper map, you can also figure out what's 1,000 feet. But Google Maps is pretty handy because if you open Google Maps, you can measure distance. If you right click on the map and choose measure distance, and you can actually drag your mouse and figure out, about 1,000 feet. And establish your start and end points there. But however you would prefer to do it, you'll want to do this ahead of time. And before you're out there actually collecting the data, it's a good idea to ride around the lake to associate your map with either GPS coordinates or shoreline landmarks. For example, here's section 1 right here. Here's an address. If you know addresses of the homes along here, you could record that. If you have GPS, it's really nice to just write down the latitude and longitude at the beginning and the end of each segment. That makes it very easy for someone maybe next time to come back out and do the exact same sections you did. But worst comes to worst, you can always just describe landmarks. Blue house with brown roof, long dock with an alligator statue on it, whatever you can do to have something that looks fairly permanent that you can note on your data form so you know where you stopped and started. Super important though, we ask you not to use people's names for landmarks. A lot of people will say, we went from John Smith's house to Bill Snyder's house. Well, that's great, except for that's private information. We don't want to include all your neighbors' names in our database. So that means we have to go through and black out all of that information. And then it's lost. Like no one else will be able to understand where you were because it's all been blacked out. And so descriptions, GPS coordinates, things like that are really helpful. Addresses are fine, names are not. All right. Again, I've already stepped on this, but be sure to do this ahead of time. Don't try and figure out your 1,000-foot sections while you're out there collecting the data. All right, let's move into the actual scoring process. So in general, I'm going to describe a recommended process for doing this. Again, after you've done this a few sections, you may want to tweak it a little bit, and we won't stop you from doing that, but we suggest this as a place to start. So when we went out with groups to develop this, we found this worked really well. Have at least 3 people on your team. One person who's driving the boat and just responsible for that. The other 2 are collecting data. And we suggest for every 1,000-foot section, you motor 3 times along it. You'll do one kind of far out, maybe 100 yards from shore, then come in and make some more observations a little bit closer, maybe 20 to 30 yards out, and then answer the last few questions back out about 100 yards. Again, be considerate of your neighbors. If you see them watching you out there, if they come out on your deck, stop for a minute and tell them what you're up to. Otherwise, they might wonder while you are cruising their shoreline back and forth. Teams will answer those questions on every pass. The people who are collecting data, we recommend everybody has a copy of the data sheet to write their notes down. And then one person is the final scribe that writes down the decisions on how you want to answer all the questions. And the driver is just responsible for getting you where you need to be. There's a little math involved just to get everything on a 0 to 100 scale. You don't need to worry about that till you get back to shore. You don't need to do math on the boat unless you really enjoy doing math on boats. All right, here's the cover sheet. This is what's going to go. You just need one copy of this. It goes on the cover of your report. You'll have information like lake name, county and township, your field ID number, which we assign to you. Include the names of all your volunteers. This is the one place where it's okay to include people's names. We want you to do that. Then dates of the survey. It's okay if it takes you more than one day or even days over several weeks to do it. It's fine. We also ask you to answer a few questions about the lake level during your survey. Was the lake level average, low, or high? Does your lake have a legal lake level? Yes or no? If so, if you have the gauge reading, that's helpful. And then we asked you to comment on whether you felt the lake level impacted your survey results. For example, if the lake was really high when you were doing your survey, that's not ideal. We recommend you try to be out there when it's an average or normal lake level, but that's not always possible. So if the time when you were able to do it, you were like, the lake is pretty high right now, you can comment on that here and mention that maybe it made it difficult to see some of the seawalls. Maybe some seawalls were underwater and you're not really sure if there was a lot of seawall or not. You might not be able to judge vegetation as well as you could under normal conditions. So that's a space for you to make comments like that. The bottom half of your cover sheet asks you to note how many 1,000-foot sections that you did, and note if your final section was substantially shorter than 1,000 feet. You put its approximate length right here. Note if you took any pictures, and then here's where you will do some math. Again, that's at the end. You will count how many buildings and docks on your whole lake. You'll see that in a minute. And just do that little bit of math to figure out your overall lake score. All right, let's get into the meat of it now. Now we'll look at the data sheet for the 1,000-foot sections. And I'm just going to do a quick overview of the data sheet right now, and then I'm going to move back and we're going to go through each of the questions individually. I'm going to show you a lot of pictures of shorelines and how we would answer these questions for each one. So don't try and memorize all of this or remember all of this right now. So at the very top, let's say this was section 1. That's where I would start. You would put the lake name and county and date, then write down either the coordinates or a landmark at the beginning of section 1 as a description here. And then you start answering questions. So for your first pass, we suggest, again, you can do this from a little bit farther out because you don't need to see a lot of detail to record these numbers. Write down the number of homes and major buildings and the number of docks and boat lifts that you see. And when we say see, that's what we mean. What can you see from your boat? If you know there's some houses back there, but they're on the other side of a tree line and you can't see them from your boat, for the purposes of this procedure, you can just pretend they're not there. We just want you to record the things that you can see. Major buildings would be pole barns, standalone garages, maybe not a tiny little woodshed. You can make decisions on that if you want. Then you would take your boat a little bit closer in because you're going to need to see some detail, and you're going to answer some questions about the vegetation you see in the lake. And whether there is aquatic plant management happening, and we'll see examples of what we mean by that. You're going to assess the amount of downed trees or woody debris like trees, branches, trunks, that kind of thing in the lake, and any erosion along the shoreline. And then you'll take your boat back out a little bit farther away is what we recommend, and do some assessments about the riparian zone, meaning that strip of land between the water and the upland area. How much of it has lawn or beaches that are being maintained, or impervious surfaces like parking lots, versus how much is unmowed. And then also look at erosion control practices that you see. Are you seeing vertical seawalls? Are you seeing sloped rock that has been added to the shoreline? Or are you seeing bioengineering, which is using natural degradable materials for erosion control? Once you've answered those questions, you're done with that section, and you write down the coordinates or a landmark at the end of the section. And then you repeat that for every 1,000-foot section. On the back of that data sheet is a place to do the math I told you about. That just is some calculations to create a score that's on a 0 to 100 scale to make it easier to understand for everybody. All right, we ready to get into it? We're going to look at a lot of pictures now. So we asked you to count houses and buildings, and also to count docks and boat lifts. And that's pretty straightforward until you get out on the lake. And sometimes you see some fairly complicated dock structures. What we suggest is that if you see a dock like this one that might have an L shape or a T shape, and it has boat lifts and maybe parking spaces for more than a couple boats, you may want to count that as more than one dock. Because what we're looking at here is how developed the shoreline is. So something like this, I would probably count as 2 docks because there's so much going on here. We've talked to people on lakes that have marinas, and they of course had to be, kind of raise their number of docks on that because there was actually a marina on the large lake. So you could use how many boat parking spaces do you see as a surrogate for number of docks if you have a lot of large and complex dock structures in your lake. The next questions that you will see have to do with what you're seeing along your 1,000-foot section. What percentage of that 1,000-foot section has some feature? So for example, on this, hide this real quick so I can't see it. Good. So what you can see here is you have a question about emerging and floating vegetation. And the question on the data sheet asks you, is there none? Is it in less than 10% of the section, 10 to 25% of the section, 25 to 75% of the section, or more than 75% of the section? Many of the questions on this data sheet are structured that way. And what it's asking you to do is consider that full 1,000-foot section. How much of it can you see emergent or floating vegetation? And what do we mean by emergent and floating vegetation? Well, plants like lily pads, floating. Plants like cattails and rushes and reeds that stick up out of the water, that's your emergent vegetation. So this whole area has emergent and floating vegetation. So if this was 1,000 feet, I would say 100% of my section is covered with emergent or floating vegetation. And as you can see at the very top of that slide, if you can see it, it's pretty small, but it's also on the data sheet. There's a number in parentheses after each option. So in this case, because more than 75% of this section, if it were 1,000 feet, has emergent and floating vegetation, that number in parentheses 4, you get 4 points for this question. You get the highest number of points because having all this natural vegetation is a good thing for shorelines. Here's some more examples of emergent and floating vegetation, water shield growing here. You've got some lily pads that are sticking up out of the water. All of this is emergent and floating vegetation. If you have algae floating on the surface, yep, count that too. We don't expect you to identify what kind of plant it is. We're not even going to ask you whether it's native or invasive. We don't care for the score of the shore. We just want to know, is the vegetation there or not? Oops, wrong way. The next question is structured exactly the same, except for it's asking you about submerged vegetation. It may come close to the surface and maybe a small flower or the reproductive structure may break the surface, but the rest is underwater. That's submerged vegetation. Stuff like your pond weeds, water milfoil, coontail, things like that. So this is submerged vegetation, and you do the same thing. Assess what percentage of that 1,000-foot section can you see submerged vegetation. Some of it may be far below the surface, growing low against the lake bottom. That still counts. But we do have an option here because sometimes, depending on your lake, the conditions in your lake, you may find that you just can't tell from the boat if there's aquatic vegetation submerged there or not. And if that's the case, we do give you the option to check unable to see. If you're just not sure for this section, it's okay to check that. The next question asks you if aquatic plant management is evident or known in your section. And the answers are either no or yes, and it's minor, or yes, and it's major. And so minor just means if you know people or can tell people are managing the plants just around their docks or swim areas, but it hasn't impacted the entire area. So a little bubbler like this to keep aquatic plants from growing in an area, that's minor. That's a small area that's being managed. But if you know that a harvester comes through and clears out all the aquatic plants along that section, that's major. Here's an example of weed rollers. Maybe you can see those circles, and here's an area where basically this is a device that pivots and rolls around the lake bottom to knock down aquatic plant life. And if it was just being done at maybe one house along your whole 1,000-foot section, then I'd probably consider that minor management. But if you can see in this picture, they've moved them around. You can see these circles, circles. The only areas that aren't being managed look to be right here and maybe right here. With that much weed rolling going on, I'd call it major. All right, moving on to some good stuff, woody debris. And even though debris may not sound good, it is good for a lake. This is habitat. This is structure for things that live in the lake. And it also helps prevent erosion because it provides reinforcement if there's enough of it. So partially or fully submerged wood in the lake counts. If the lake is really low when you do the survey, feel free to count any wood that you see along the shoreline that is currently exposed but would normally be at least partially submerged. Also, concentrate your efforts on counting pieces that are, as big around as your arm or larger in diameter. Don't worry about counting little twigs. That's not going to do you any good. So it asks you to count how much wood is in the lake over that 1,000-foot section. Either none, just a few pieces like 1 to 5, several pieces like 6 to 15. And if it's more than 16, you get the highest score of many pieces of wood in your lake. Just a few other examples of natural wood in the stream, or in the lake. Sometimes wood is placed on purpose to prevent erosion or provide habitat. This is an example of that, where logs have been placed along a shoreline where wood habitat had previously been removed. Of course, that counts as well. Here's another example of wood along a shoreline where tree stumps and logs have been used along a residential shoreline as a natural way to prevent erosion and still provide all sorts of little habitats for critters along the shoreline, which looks really nice, as opposed to, at least in my ecologist point of view, as opposed to a vertical seawall. All right. Next question is to ask you about what kind of erosion you might see happening along the shoreline. And your options are none, minor, moderate, or severe. We understand this is subjective, and that's okay. We give you some examples of what we're thinking when we think about minor, moderate, or severe, but really feel free to work with the other folks on your boat. That's why it's great to have more than one person so you can discuss among yourself if we think something is moderate or severe. But here's some examples that we'd share from our perspective. You can see on this lawn, it looks like there might be a little bit of erosion happening along the lakeshore here. It looks like vegetation has been lost, probably because they've left boats sitting here for a long time or something. So there's a little bit of minor evidence of erosion. Of course, this is just one property. It's not the whole 1,000 foot, but just to give you an idea of what we're talking about. This is a little more. This is, I would say, at least moderate. If it was all along the stretch, it might be considered worse. I mean, we don't see a hillside trying to fall into the lake, but you can see perhaps the property owner may be putting some rock in here to try and slow down the erosion. I would definitely consider this a moderate erosion situation. Here's another moderate situation where you can see, they've mowed all the way down with the picnic table and the trash can. I'm guessing this is a park of some kind where mowing is very, very common. And then you can see chunks of the shoreline have washed right in. They're definitely seeing some erosion, probably considered moderate at this point. It's getting a little worse here, maybe. You can see erosion all along the shoreline here and this slope where, again, they've tried to maintain just turf grass, and that does not have the roots to hold a sloping hillside back. And so, they've also put in a seawall and things like that. So I would definitely say you can see right here soil that is washing over the seawall. So I would say moderate erosion here. Here's an example of something I'd call severe, at least for this small stretch. You've got big chunks of the hill slope just falling right into the lake. Sometimes the erosion that you see may be caused by direct activity on a shoreline. This property seems to have no vegetation on the slope, and it has the potential for serious erosion. I'd probably want to get a little bit closer to see if there's any evidence of active erosion. Just because you see exposed soil on a hill doesn't mean it's making its way into the lake, but if you get a little closer, you'll probably be able to tell. A question that we get sometimes is, does having a beach count as erosion? It only counts as erosion if there are active signs of the sand being lost to the lake. So it's a fairly common practice for people to bring sand in a truck and put it on their shoreline to create a beach. And in many situations, first time it rains, a lot of that washes right into the lake, and that's active erosion. So if you can see that there's active signs of sand being lost to the lake, then I'd count it as erosion. But if your lake is naturally sandy, sand beaches may be a natural feature, and so you wouldn't count that as erosion. Otherwise, every sandy beach would score really badly, or sandy lake. And, we know here in Michigan, we do have some really sandy lakes. So only if you see sand being lost into the lake from an area is it considered erosion. All right, the next question is looking at some other bad stuff. And you'll notice that the points on these questions are actually negative. The more you have, the more points you lose. So for this one, you want to combine any maintained lawn, maintained or artificial beach, or impervious surface, and how much of your 1,000-foot section do those land uses make? You know what this is. It's a maintained lawn. I don't need to explain that to you. This site has maintained lawn and a little bit of impervious surface. When we say impervious surface, what we're talking about is any surface on the land that the rainwater can't soak into. So pavement, blacktop, even landscape tile like this that's placed so close together that water just washes off it instead of having it spaced out where rain can soak in is considered impervious surface. Here's maintained lawn with impervious surface right next to it. You've got a parking lot and then lawn. So all of that would count towards your percentage. Here's some impervious surface. Again, you've got landscape pavers right up against each other. So this counts as impervious surface, although the gravel and the wood chips would not. You can, water can soak into that, but you would count all of this. Sometimes you'll see stamped concrete or other kinds of patios along the water. This is impervious surface. Here's an example of both maintained lawn and maintained beach here. You can tell that isn't normally like that they've brought sand in there. So you would count that as in your maintained lawn and beach percentage. Here's that same picture again of the beach I showed you before, where clearly they have delineated a beach area and brought sand in. This is definitely a maintained beach, so you would count that. All right, next question. This is getting back to some good stuff. Unmowed vegetation. A lot of properties will be like this and will have a belt or strip of unmowed vegetation between the lake and the lawn or other kinds of land use. And we like seeing this. And, the more of it there is along the lake shore, the better. And also the deeper it goes upland, the better. You could have a really skinny strip, or you could have 10 feet, 15 feet, 40 feet from the lake shore upland that hasn't been mowed. So that's what we're getting at when we ask about the average unmowed vegetation belt depth. So we want to know what of the 1,000-foot section has unmowed vegetation, and of that, about how deep does it go upland. So those are the two things we ask you to look for. Here's the length or percentage along your 1,000-foot, and then how far it goes back. Sometimes your unmowed vegetation belt will be quite long, but it doesn't have much depth. And this is an example of that. And I will note too, we've gotten questions about this before. Does it still count if there's rocks and stuff piled beneath it? It absolutely does. Yes, count this towards unmowed vegetation. We'll talk about the rocks here in a minute under another category. So this has a fairly long percentage that's unmowed vegetation, but the depth is fairly narrow, only a couple of feet. Here's another example. This is a house that has a little bit of variety going on, but really they haven't started mowing until way back here. It looks like they have a little lawn that they maintain upland here, but all of this counts as unmowed vegetation this far back, and of course the whole width. And this one is a very natural property. If it goes dense enough that you can't see through it, then count it as over 40 feet. It's a good rule of thumb. Here's an example of a property that has a little bit of everything going on. You would count their dock. You might even count this as 2 because you can park a boat here. You can park a boat here. They have a kayak launch. There's a lot going on. They have a really deep unmowed vegetation belt over on this side of the property, and then a really thin one here. So again, we're just looking for averages across the 1,000-foot section. So you'll have to make a judgment on that. Erosion control. So there's 3 different categories of erosion control that we ask you to comment on. And the first one is vertical and artificial. So vertical, artificial, things that are up and down and not natural. So seawalls, boulder and rock walls that are vertical. These are what you'll look for and record what percentage of your section is covered by these. Steel seawalls are fairly common. Concrete seawalls are also seen. You may see them made out of boulders that pretty much go straight up and down. Large boulders and vertical walls of rock are considered vertical artificial structures, just like seawalls. And you'll note that here we have a boulder wall in front of a concrete seawall. So it's pretty clearly a vertical artificial piece of erosion control. I would also consider this example vertical. Even though there is some slope to the boulders in front of the seawall, it still wouldn't pass what I call the turtle test. If the turtle in the lake has no chance of making it up onto dry land, call it vertical. So think of a turtle and the turtle test when you're deciding whether it's vertical or considered sloped artificial, which we'll look at next. Another example is fairly vertical. I'm not quite sure from this picture how tall this is, so I would apply the turtle test if I got a little closer to decide how I wanted to judge this. All right, if it's not vertical artificial, it might be sloped artificial. This is a practice called riprap, where you have rough pieces of rock or concrete that are sloped to prevent erosion. And this is one example of sloped artificial erosion control. A turtle might struggle here too, but at least it has a chance compared to a seawall. You may see examples of sloped concrete. You may see, again, riprap like this. You may see smoother rock. It's still sloped artificial, so this would all count. And even a small amount counts. You don't want to ignore small examples of erosion control being put in, so make notes about what you see. And this would be considered sloped again. It also counts, as I hinted at before, it counts even though, or even if, there is unmowed vegetation growing on top of or behind it. You want to make sure that you count this erosion control, these rocks along here, in your sloped artificial tally. Sometimes we're not sure whether we should call something sloped or vertical. I would say at the foot of the slope where it reaches the water, this is sloped rock and riprap. There are vertical rock walls that create terraces, but they're upland of the riprap. Again, let's try the turtle test. Turtles should be able to make it up on dry land, I think. Areas over here, right there is quite sloped. Here, down here, turtle will be able to get out of the lake. You might struggle to get much further, but I would call this sloped. It would pass the turtle test. This one, is it sloped or vertical? Basically, is it seawall or riprap? Even though there's some rocks in front of the seawall, ultimately for a turtle, they're not going to clear this. It's vertical. So count it under vertical artificial. This is potentially sloped. Back in here, a turtle might be able to make it up. Again, you have to kind of use your own judgment on this. They could really improve the turtle's odds by piling the rocks up a little higher along the seawall. The final example that isn't as common, but you may see it, is bioengineering. Basically, that's soft engineering like erosion control. And note that while these areas don't get a positive score like a natural shoreline would, the score is less negative than artificial structures because although erosion is being dealt with, it's being dealt with in a way that eventually, with proper maintenance, will be indistinguishable from natural shoreline as it was originally. The shoreline will be considered recovered at that point. So, and also I would say, if you know of an area where bioengineering like this was installed years ago, but now most people wouldn't know that it ever happened, then I would consider that natural. I would not consider it part of the bioengineering score. In case you're not familiar, these are structures called core logs. They are made of coconut fiber or other biodegradable fibers, and they're used to temporarily stabilize a shoreline while plants are getting established. And you can see here in up close, you can see plantings have been done and they will grow and their roots will stabilize the soil there eventually, and the core logs will be able to just biodegrade and won't be necessary anymore. And sometimes you see these done on a large scale. This was a project done by a city along a shoreline they owned that was suffering some erosion. Other types of bioengineering are like this example we saw before, where we have stumps and branch bundles that are placed on purpose, natural biodegradable materials placed on purpose to stop erosion. I would include this in my bioengineering assessment. All right, we're going to wrap up with a few examples of things that, that you might see and might not be sure right away what to call them. Stuff like this, I would call this, I'd think about my turtle again. I would call this sloped artificial. I think a turtle could make it through. You also have an unmowed vegetation belt here. Even if it's not the most attractive one, it counts. Something like this. Again, there's no unmowed vegetation, so you get a 0 for that. We have erosion control for sure. It's artificial, but is it vertical or sloped? Again, turtle test. Turtle might have a tough time here. It's probably would be considered vertical. All right, that's the end of the picture show. Just a couple examples or comments about pictures. It's really helpful to take photos because after you've looked at your whole lake, you're going to start to forget what you saw in different places. So take pictures. You can even include some of your best pictures with your report to us into our database. You can upload 3 pictures for each section. So if you want to capture examples of things that you saw in different areas, you can do that. You can take as many pictures as you want for your own use, but we'll only accept 3 because that's how our website is set up. Blurry photos are not helpful. You can delete those. I know I always think I've taken a bunch of great pictures and I go back and look, especially when I'm on a boat and things can be quite blurry. Location is really important. Take picture, I like to take a picture of the number, like write it on a scrap of paper on a dry erase board, a big number 3, take a picture of that on my camera. So I know the pictures that follow are from section 3, or have some kind of note taking as you're taking the pictures. Really helpful, or else they're all going to look the same when you get back to your computer. And then when you're all done, as always, submit your data to us. You can enter your data onto the MiCorps Data Exchange, our website. There's instructions right there on our website that will walk you through how to do it. One thing to keep in mind with Score the Shore in particular, you're going to have a lot of data to enter, and it's going to take you a minute to do it. You can't start and then leave and come back a week later and finish it. Our computer system will think it's a totally different lake. You have to do it all at once. So set aside a bit of time to do it so you can get it done in one sitting. And again, you can upload photos for each section. Make sure that you send a copy of your complete report to us, either through the mail or you can scan, take photos of them, send them to us via email, including that survey cover sheet, a copy of the section data form for each section of your lake, a map showing us where your sections are, and but don't send us your photographs. You can submit those through the database.